a student, as you are, and later a scholar, exploring and interrogating ideas that have to do with the community in which you find the most belonging. In other words, what is the space, the community, or the group that you most identify becomes the one in which you most, or that you think most deeply about, that you interrogate the most. And not necessarily with the goal to criticize, to beat down, to reject, but to make that community or place a better one. This captures the way in which I live the life of the mind, or have lived it as a scholar. And it starts with that community that I find the most belonging. Here in Atlanta, Georgia, I was raised in a Muslim community, African American Muslim community, and there are many things I can tell you about it, but what I will tell you that I will refer back to in my talk is that it was a community of strong women, strong Black women. They were excellent mothers, they were educated, they were active in their communities, they loved their religion. They also had a revolutionary spirit because the Muslim women that I looked up to and who raised me, they were converts. And they converted to Islam in a time, in the 60s and 70s, when conversion to Islam meant that you were a revolutionary. It meant that you were rejecting the status quo, that you were embracing Blackness, often rejecting whiteness. That's what it meant at that time, but it has many meanings, of course. So I grew up hearing these stories of revolutionary, strong women who cared about their families and communities. So that's where I started. One of the first places where I really began, though, to think very analytically about this community, of course, was when I went to college, right? And it really just started with taking courses in Islam. And so I was introduced to studying your religion in an academic, or as an academic discipline. Okay, that's very different from studying your religion as, or how you study it in Sunday school, or at church, or at the mosque, during congregational prayers. It's very different. And what I learned in that process was very liberating, because I learned that there were different ways of being Muslim, right, and practicing Islam. Not all Muslim women cover as I do. Not all Muslim women have the same skin that I do. They're Arab and South Asian, African American, Latino Muslim women. And I also learned that there are different ways of reading the Quran, reading the text within a religion. And it was liberating because I was better able to embrace people. Because when you have a narrow idea of how we're supposed to look as Christians, as Muslims, as Black people, as Americans, it confines you. You judge people. But when you're able to be open to the flexibility in a certain tradition, then you're better able to embrace all kinds of people. So it was very liberating for me in that way. I actually majored in electrical engineering when I was in college, but I did decide to double major in religious studies because after I took one course in Islam, I wanted to take another. And I decided by my senior year, or the summer before my senior year, that it was really religious studies that I wanted to pursue. That's really what gave me that high that Dr. Williams talked about, right? I chose engineering at first because, I did well in math and sciences. I knew that I could have a lucrative career. I heard, there weren't enough minorities in engineering. So all these reasons I chose it, but it really wasn't my passion. So anyway, I ended up pursuing Islamic studies, religious studies. And it was really interesting because by the time I started graduate school, I started graduate school at Duke University, and I was talking to my advisor, a white man, and I told him that I want to do something on African American Muslims, right? I want to write about this community that I grew up in. And he said, that's fine, but you're going to have to talk about women. And I resisted, silently. I don't think I did it openly or verbally. Silently, I resisted. And why? Because I knew that there was I knew there were negative assumptions about Islam and Muslim women in the larger public, right? That Muslim women are treated badly, etc. And so, in a sense, I thought that his suggestion was feeding into that. Or in other words, when you think an idea is so ridiculous, because I knew strong Black Muslim women, right? So I knew that it was absurd that Muslim women are oppressed, right? So I thought that it wasn't even worthy of considering that issue, right? But of course, I mean, it was flawed thinking, and I realize that now, but that thinking came from a place, and it actually came from my community. I remember once where the imam, which is the minister, that's comparison for the minister of my mosque, once in one of his religious lectures, he talked about the gender equality in Islam, and then went on to say that there's no need, therefore, for feminism in Islam, because again, Islam intrinsically gives women rights, and so I think I deeply believe that, and that was another reason why I probably resisted this advisor's suggestion that I have to do something on women and gender. Well, there's no reason to talk about it because I know that Muslim women are not oppressed. So that was one interesting conversation where in the academy I began to realize that I had to begin to interrogate the information that I had gained in the community that I came from. Now, of course, gaining a doctorate in the arts and sciences at Duke University in the new millennium, to do that, there was no way that I could escape feminism and gender studies and women's studies, right? So the topic came up over and over again. And literally by the time that I began writing my dissertation, I realized that if I'm going to talk about African Americans, and I had decided to talk about women, African American women at that point, that if I'm going to talk about African American Muslim women and the significance of Islam in their lives, that there was no way that I could ignore this deep legacy of thought, of feminist thought, right? There was no way I could escape it. Because if I wanted to write about, again, the significance of Islam, for instance, in my mother's life. My mother was a little girl who, after playing out in the hot sun, she would spend hours in the bathtub trying to wash away her suntan, right? So this same little girl, she went to a church where all of the images of Jesus and of Mary, they were all white. So what kind of effect does this have, this religious setting have on a little girl who's already struggling with her identity as a Black person? And when she asked the priest, well, if Mary is white, does that mean that God is white? Mary, the mother of God? And the priest, of course, said yes, right? So the significance of Islam in her life, well, I should say one of the reasons that Islam was appealing to her, because there were no images. There were no images of the divine in mosques. There were no Black ones, there were no white ones, right? So this is why Islam was appealing to her. So in order to talk about the significance of Islam to these women, I had to situate them within the everyday struggles of Black women. I had to situate them within a context in which structures of gender and race and class intersect to affect these women's lives. And then when I fit their stories in this context, I can better bring out the significance of Islam and begin to talk about Islam beyond just a religious faith, right? But as a social force, right? functions in people's lives beyond just theological. So that's the point, is that I had to draw upon this legacy. But then there was another problem, though. You know, I studied feminism, all types. I didn't agree with everything that I learned in my courses about feminism. I didn't agree with every feminist scholar, and so you'll find yourself in the same position. And it's good. You should not agree with everything that you read. We are teaching you to think analytically and critically about what you encounter in class and beyond. So that was the issue there. But this again was the reason why Black feminism was so liberating, because Black feminism taught me that there are different forms of feminism, right? Because Black feminism is different from white feminism. Now, I don't know if these are all the best terms and categories to use, but